Betrayal. We have known for some time in Mark's Gospel that the opposition to Jesus' ministry was growing. Mark told us when he named Judas in the list of the 12 disciples in chapter 3, verses 13 through 19. Mark lists 12 and points out how Jesus changed Simon's name to Peter and nicknamed James and John, the brothers Boanerges, the sons of thunder. But the rest are simply named until the final name in the list. And Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Nothing more is said. If we were reading the story for the very first time, we would be drawn into the story, inclined to want to skip ahead, searching out for the part where the disciple, this chosen follower, gave up on Jesus. We would be looking for that part of the story which revealed to us exactly what happened between the two men to make the one betray the other. What did Jesus do that made Judas react in such a way as to plot with the opposition to stop Jesus? We have a tendency during the Passion narrative to isolate and focus on the one betrayer and those who made up the opposition. But the characters in the Passion narrative are many. Juxtaposed against the opposition plot is the story of the woman who anointed Jesus with oil, who tended to his needs by pouring obscenely expensive oil on his person. That costly ointment offered to Jesus by a total stranger, lovingly, sacrificially, is contrasted with the unremarkable sum of money paid to the chosen disciple who could not comprehend such a love. Mark's Jesus has been saying all along that he will be handed over to those who oppose him. He even cautions his followers on this very night, "You will all become deserters." Let us confess that we are not strangers to acts of betrayal, lest we exclude ourselves from this human folly. It would be better to confess that we have all done it. We have all been drawn in by someone or something, by some idea that promised to rid us of the source of irritation, that offered something for almost nothing, that logically pointed out that this one thing in our lives, this one person in our lives was the source of our distress, and if he or she was gone, everything would be just fine. Everything would go back to the way it used to be, predictable and comfortable. Maybe that is all that Judas wanted, for things to be the way they were in the beginning. But it's much too late for that now. Preparation. Just like the elaborate preparation for the Palm Sunday entrance into the city of Jerusalem, Mark's Jesus already seems to have made plans and arrangements. In truth, Passover is all about preparation. In the case of the Exodus, the Jews were to be prepared at a moment's notice to flee Egypt. The preparation of the Passover for 2 millennia has been symbolic of that preparation. When Jesus' disciples ask where he wants them to prepare to make the preparations, that is, for Jesus to eat the Passover meal, he sends 2, perhaps the same 2 disciples that made the preparations on Palm Sunday, to make preparations in the city by finding a man with a jar of water. He instructs them to follow him, and whatever building that man enters, they are to say to the owner of the house, "The teacher asks where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples." Mark's Jesus goes into detail about the room which the 2 unnamed disciples will be shown, large and furnished, where they will make preparations for the meal. The disciples go and find everything once again, just as Jesus had described it to them. They get about their work, preparing for the traditional meal with Jesus. And I am left wondering if the 2 disciples sent to procure the colt for the ride into the city on Palm Sunday are the same 2 disciples sent to prepare the Passover meal. Is it Peter and Andrew? Is it James and John? Or Philip and Bartholomew? Is it Matthew and James, the sons of Alphaeus? Or is it Thaddeus and Simon of Cana? Or is it Judas Iscariot and Thomas? Since the 2 disciples on both occasions are unnamed, I'm wondering if they're women disciples of Jesus. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Or is it Joanna, the wife of Chuza? As the wife of Herod's chief steward, indeed, she would be an influential arranger with all of her connections in the city of Jerusalem, and she would marry the wife of Cleopas, perhaps, or were the 2 sisters of Lazarus the disciples that were sent in to make the preparations? Was it Mary and Martha? They just live on the outskirts of town. Perhaps it was the mother of James and John, or the mother-in-law of Peter, sent to prepare the Passover meal. When we make preparations, we always have an eye to the outcome of our efforts. What is interesting to me is that Mark's Jesus involves his disciples in the preparation of an event whose outcome will be something they did not plan or foresee. Jesus brings his disciples to a Passover feast for which they are totally unprepared. On this night, the Passover feast was to be like none other, and would change its meaning for the disciples and for all who followed them forever. Loyalty. Mark's Jesus turns everyone's world upside down tonight. Actually, he's been doing that, turning everyone's world upside down thing since the day he came into the city of Jerusalem. No matter what they heard him say before, this is nothing like what the disciples were expecting. And now, as they are walking back to Bethany via the Mount of Olives, Jesus announces, "You will all become deserters." What? What? Haven't we come all this way with you? Haven't we followed you? Haven't we listened to you? Haven't we studied at your feet? Haven't we done everything that you instructed us to do for 3 years? How can you think that we would desert you? But Jesus is still talking to them, trying to assure them that there is more to come than when he is raised up, and he will go before them to Galilee. Peter, who has found his way to the number 1 slot among the disciples, perhaps because he and Andrew were the first to follow, will remain loyal. He asserts with a few of my own verbal embellishments, "Even though all the rest of them become deserters, I will not." This is pretty nearly an accusation by Peter that his fellow disciples will fail where he will not. He knows, he believes that there is absolutely nothing that would cause him to give up, to walk away, to desert his master, his teacher, his friend. Nothing! Nevertheless, Jesus warns him. He warns Peter that he will. Indeed, he will disavow Jesus. He will deny Jesus. He will claim not to know the man, not once, not twice, but 3 times this very night. Is this a premonition of Jesus? Does he have foreknowledge, the inside track on what is to come? We've been wondering since Sunday if he is clairvoyant on top of everything else. Or is it that Jesus knows his followers better than they know themselves? Because his disciples are who they are, their behavior will be predictable. Imagine, if you can, what Peter feels when he is told that he will not be strong enough to withstand the pressure. Imagine how Peter feels when he hears that Jesus believes him to be no different from the rest of the disciples. That he is an ordinary man who, when the time comes, will run for his life. What we must ask ourselves, because it is important, will the disciples' desertion and Peter's denial mean that they are disloyal followers? Willingness. As the disciples continue to walk with Jesus and contemplate all that he has said, they arrive at the place called Gethsemane. It is late, but Jesus stops on the way. He's agitated and distressed, and he needs to stop. He needs to collect himself and find some peace for his soul in prayer. He asks the disciples to wait outside the garden, and he takes Peter and James and John with him. My soul is deeply grieved, even to death. We would say, I'm scared to death. I'm terrified. The Greek word for this is paralogos. It means overcome with grief, overcome with sorrow. Jesus asks Peter and the sons of thunder, James and John, to keep awake, to stand watch. It is another way of saying stand guard while I pray. He did not invite them to stay close, as he moved off away from them, and suddenly, please picture this, and suddenly threw himself to the ground. This is not a gentle gesture of getting down on his knees. Throwing oneself to the ground is a last-ditch pleading. Mark tells us that he prays that please let it be possible that this hour of distress and agitation and terror and fear be gone. Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. Plainly, he wants the terror to subside, the inevitable to go away. He got up from his prone position, face to the ground, and went back to join Peter, James, and John, who were standing guard. But were they? Well, they were asleep. How long was he gone? How long was he gone? How could you not stay awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you do not come into the time of trial, that you do not come into the time of trial. I think this is a stark reference of Jesus back to Peter's insistence that he will never desert his master. Falling asleep when you have been asked to keep awake, what is that called? Your spirit may be willing to do as I ask, but your flesh is not able to. These 3 sleeping disciples are encountered sleeping 3 times by Jesus. When he finally says to them, "Are you still sleeping? Taking your rest? Enough! Enough!" I picture the way he says this. I picture his distress and his agitation not clear. Enough! Get up! It's time to go. See, my betrayer is at hand. I have been deserted. I have been left on my own. What do we learn from the disciples on this night of nights? Well, perhaps the most important thing we learn is that in truth, in life, we are them and they are us. They show us tonight that discipleship is a weight we take on voluntarily when we confess our belief in Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. In fact, discipleship excuses us from nothing and expects more than we can bear to give. On this night of nights, 11 disciples prepared to be with Jesus. On this night of nights, 11 disciples prepared to be with him through thick and thin. They professed their undying loyalty. They went with him into the darkness, but the terror of what happened in the darkness overtook them and they fled. If they are arrested with Jesus, if they are put on trial and crucified with Jesus, they would be remembered perhaps as martyrs to the cause. But who then would be left to tell this story? And how would we come to understand that Jesus went before us and for us into the darkness to be our light?